October 30th, 1975. It was the night before Halloween in the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Belle Haven in Greenwich, Connecticut. The kind of neighborhood where nothing truly bad was ever supposed to happen. But this particular night would mark the beginning of a mystery so chilling, so tangled in wealth and power, that it would go on to haunt the town for decades. That evening, 15-year-old Martha Moxley had gone out with some friends to enjoy the traditional Mischief Night antics. She laughed, joked, and wandered through the neighborhood. Eventually, she ended up at the Skakel residence, a large, luxurious home just across the way. The Skakel boys, Tommy and Michael, were well known in the area. They came from money, a family with deep political ties, even connected to the Kennedys. But the fun of that night would soon turn into horror. The next morning, Martha didn't come home. Her mother began to worry almost immediately. And when she went out searching, she found something she would never forget. There, beneath a pine tree in their own backyard, lay her daughter's body, brutally murdered. She had been bludgeoned with a golf club so violently that the shaft had shattered. A piece of it was even lodged in her neck. Whoever killed her hadn't just wanted to hurt her. They wanted to destroy her. It was a scene so gruesome, it shocked even seasoned investigators. And yet, the nightmare was only beginning. Because in this story, the deeper they dug, the darker it got. In the immediate aftermath of Martha's murder, the police turned their attention to the last people known to have seen her alive, Tommy and Michael Skakel. Tommy, the older of the two Skakel brothers, had been with Martha the night she died. He told police that the two of them had spent some time together on the lawn, horsing around, before she left to go home. But there was one big problem with his story. The timeline didn't add up. He claimed that Martha left around 9:30 p.m., but the autopsy and witness statements suggested she likely died around 10 p.m. Michael, on the other hand, said he had gone to a cousin's house to watch Monty Python and came back around 11 p.m. He claimed that later, he climbed a tree outside Martha's house to get her attention, something no one could corroborate. But what really raised eyebrows were the golf clubs. The one used to kill Martha was a Tony Penna, an expensive club that matched a set found right inside the Skakel garage. The Skakels didn't even deny it. The club was theirs. And still no arrests were made. For years, the case went cold. Whispers swirled through Greenwich, but without any definitive proof, the case remained unsolved. The Skakel name, closely linked to the Kennedy family, carried a powerful weight, enough to silence questions and suppress suspicions. But then came the 1990s, and with it, a renewed interest in the case. Investigators began to take another look at the events of that night, and what they found raised serious concerns. The question wasn't just who did it anymore. It became, why didn't anyone do anything about it sooner? By the early 1990s, the Moxley case had become the ghost of Greenwich, a cold case buried under privilege, influence, and silence. But a small group of determined investigators refused to let Martha's murder remain forgotten. Detective Frank Garr and police officer Steve Carroll, alongside investigative journalist Leonard Levitt. These men revisited every inch of the original investigation. They pored over old files, re-interviewed witnesses, and challenged old assumptions. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about redemption. They weren't the only ones digging deeper. In the late 90s, the Skakel family, perhaps sensing the renewed heat, commissioned their own private investigation. They hired Sutton Associates, a firm known for unearthing secrets, although maybe not always the ones you want revealed. Ironically, the Sutton report, meant to clear Michael's name, ended up doing the exact opposite. In a stunning twist, the report revealed that Michael had changed his story. Suddenly, he wasn't watching Monty Python with his cousin during the critical window after 9:30 p.m. Now he claimed that he had gone back to Martha's house, climbed a tree near her window, and helped himself out while watching her. That revelation alone shocked investigators. Why would anyone change their alibi years later, especially to something so strange and specific? More importantly, what was Michael doing just feet away from the spot where Martha's body was later found? Then came more testimony, this time from people who had been in the Elon School with Michael, a controversial behavioral institution in Maine. According to some of those students, Michael had allegedly confessed to killing Martha while they were both residents there. One student remembered Michael screaming, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." Another recalled Michael admitting to swinging a golf club at a girl, describing the moment with eerie detail. Still, these accounts were murky. Elon was notorious for its abusive methods, and many of its confessions were extracted under duress or manipulation. But taken together, with Michael's shifting timeline, they painted a troubling picture. Suddenly, the wall of protection around Michael Skakel didn't seem so unbreakable anymore. By the year 2000, the pressure was unbearable. The cold case of Martha Moxley had been defrosted and reheated, but now there was enough heat to ignite legal action. Fueled by the Sutton Report, confessions from Elon school students, and Michael Skakel's own bizarre admissions, a Connecticut judge issued a warrant for his arrest. On January 19, 2000, more than 24 years after Martha's brutal murder, Michael Skakel, now 39 years old, was formally charged with murder. Greenwich was stunned. The Skakel name, long cloaked in the armor of wealth and legacy, was now the headline of a murder case that refused to die. Michael pleaded not guilty. His attorneys claimed there was no physical evidence, no murder weapon directly tying him to the crime, and that decades had eroded the reliability of any witness testimony. Still, the prosecution had something powerful: Michael's own words. They used his shifting stories, his unsettling behavior, and the recollections of those who said he confessed as ammunition. They painted Michael as a jealous, volatile teenager who had been obsessed with Martha. His original alibi? Destroyed. His reputation? Cracked. And his freedom? Hanging by a thread. The trial began in May 2002. Courtroom drama exploded almost daily. The media swarmed the courthouse. Reporters from every network covered, desperate for any new soundbite or twist. People across the country were riveted. It wasn't just the brutal murder of a beautiful young girl anymore. It was the Skakel name, the Kennedy connection, and the haunting idea that justice could be both delayed and denied for decades. Prosecutors laid out a devastating timeline, emphasizing Michael's sudden late-night visit to Martha's house and how it overlapped dangerously with the time of her death. They dug deep into the twisted history of the Elon school, revealing how Michael may have cracked under its pressure and confessed. The defense? They hit back hard, arguing that the Elon confessions were unreliable and possibly coerced. They highlighted the lack of physical evidence, suggested other possible suspects, including Michael's own brother Tommy, and reminded the jury that decades-old memories can warp over time. But the jury had heard enough. In June of 2002, Michael Skakel was found guilty of the murder of Martha Moxley. Nearly 3 decades after that terrible Halloween night, someone was finally held responsible. The courtroom erupted, some in gasps, others in sobs. Martha's mother, Dorothy, felt a sliver of justice, but no real peace. Michael faced 20 years to life in prison. But little did anyone know that this verdict would be just the beginning of another storm. After nearly 3 decades of silence, it seemed justice had spoken. In June 2002, Michael Skakel was convicted of murdering Martha Moxley. The sentence? Anywhere from 20 years to life in prison. But just when the public started to think this chapter had finally closed, the case veered into even murkier waters. And leading the charge to undo it all was someone whose last name rang loudly in every American household: Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Yes, that Robert Kennedy Jr., the environmental activist and nephew of President John F. Kennedy. At the time, he was already becoming a controversial figure, and now he was stepping directly into the fray of a murder case, vowing that his cousin Michael had been wrongfully convicted. Kennedy didn't just have doubts. He had a mission. He claimed Michael's words in the Sutton Report were twisted and taken out of context. But it didn't stop there. He also went after the Elon school confession, pointing out something chilling. The key witness who claimed Michael had confessed was under the influence of drugs at the time he made the statement. Worse, he died before ever testifying in court. To Kennedy, that made the entire confession useless. Then came the twist no one saw coming. 8 months into Michael's prison sentence, Kennedy received a tip that changed everything. A man named Tony Bryant, a former classmate of Michael's at Brunswick School and, interestingly, the cousin of NBA legend Kobe Bryant, came forward with a story so unbelievable it threatened to unravel everything the court had just decided. Tony claimed that on the night of Martha's murder, he was in Greenwich with two friends from New York, one named Al and the other named Burton. According to Tony, Al had shown a disturbing interest in Martha and had become visibly jealous that she was spending time with other boys. And then, Al allegedly said something haunting. "I don't understand why she's spending time with those guys when she could be with me." That night, the three of them had been hanging around the Skakel property when Al and Burton spotted some golf clubs. Without warning, they started talking about wanting to hurt someone. Tony, sensing something terrible was about to happen, backed off. He raised his hands and left, leaving Al and Burton behind. The next day, Tony said, Al and Burton hinted that they had done something to someone, but they never mentioned Martha's name. Still, in hindsight, Tony believed it could only have been her. The town was buzzing with news of her murder, and everything pointed back to that night. But the question loomed. Why had Tony waited over 2 decades to speak up? His answer? He was terrified. Terrified of being framed, of being caught up in something he hadn't done. His own mother, he said, had warned him to stay silent. Now, Kennedy and Michael's new legal team believed they had a bombshell, a potential confession from new suspects who had never been part of the original investigation. And just like that, the case was turned on its head, again. With Tony Bryant's shocking revelations in hand, Michael Skakel's legal team acted fast. In 2005, they filed a request for a new trial, arguing that an innocent man was behind bars while the Real killers walked free. But justice wasn't going to make things easy. Tony agreed to share his story, but only on one condition. He would not testify in court unless granted full immunity. Without it, he feared being held responsible simply for being associated with Al and Burton or bringing them to Greenwich that night. He hadn't committed any violence himself, but guilt by association was enough to scare him. When the court denied immunity, Tony refused to testify. The defense was left with only a videotaped statement to present in court. The result? The judge wasn't convinced. Despite the explosive nature of Tony's claims, the court ruled 4-1 against granting a new trial. The tape, they decided, was not credible enough. Without Tony's live testimony or any concrete proof of Al and Burton's involvement, it was deemed a weak foundation to overturn a conviction. Still, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wasn't backing down. In 2016, he published a book titled Framed, digging deeper into the case and Tony Bryant's version of events. Kennedy used excerpts from Martha's own diary to argue that she had encountered Tony, Al, and Burton. According to him, the boys she danced with shortly before her death might have been the very individuals Tony mentioned. But there was a catch. Martha never actually mentioned any of them by name. She wrote vaguely about meeting some boys at a dance. And those boys? When questioned, they had no recollection of ever seeing Tony, Al, or Burton that night. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. Was Tony lying? Or, at the very least, was his memory skewed? Even more troubling, Al, one of the men Tony implicated, had an attorney who fiercely denied the accusations. He labeled them completely false and baseless. And worse, he accused Michael's defense team of using race as a smokescreen, scapegoating Al, a man of color, in a desperate bid to save a privileged, white Kennedy relative. The mess didn't end there. AL's attorney also fired back at Tony, portraying him as anything but a credible witness. At the time, Tony had a criminal record, including charges of armed robbery. He was even serving a 7-year sentence for tax evasion when the videotape was recorded. To critics, this made his story less like a bombshell and more like a last-ditch move from a desperate man. What had started as a promise of vindication for Michael Skakel now looked like a circus. Power, privilege, and prejudice were all tangled together. Even new evidence couldn't escape the cloud of influence hanging over this case. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get more convoluted, another key player stepped into the spotlight, Michael's original defense attorney. And what came next would once again change everything. Following the collapse of the Tony Bryant lead, Michael Skakel's legal team turned their attention to someone else. Mickey Sherman, his original defense attorney. Their claim? Mickey hadn't done his job. According to the new attorneys, Mickey Sherman was more focused on the media spotlight than defending his client. They alleged that during Michael's trial, he was basking in fame, chasing interviews, and making headlines instead of building a solid case. Even worse, Michael accused him of accepting substantial legal fees without delivering effective representation. It was a stunning accusation that Michael's own defense had failed him not due to lack of evidence, but due to neglect. And it worked. In October 2013, a Connecticut judge named Thomas Bishop ruled in Michael's favor. The judge agreed that Michael had not received a fair trial, pointing out that a more attentive and thorough defense could have made all the difference. It sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The Moxley family, along with state prosecutors, were blindsided. After all these years, they believed the case had finally reached its conclusion. But now it was being reopened, and Michael was being given another shot at freedom. Judge Bishop's ruling went beyond legal technicalities. He made it clear this case had been mishandled. Details that should have been examined more closely were brushed aside. Alternative suspects weren't investigated deeply enough. And the defense lacked the comprehensive strategy needed for a case of this magnitude. But that wasn't the only revelation stirring unease. As the case was reopened, Tommy Skakel's role resurfaced in disturbing ways. Now, not only were the brothers pointing fingers at each other, but new questions emerged about who was lying and why. Tommy had already admitted to being the last person to see Martha alive. He had also lied to the police during the initial investigation, a detail that felt far more serious now than it had decades ago. And just when it seemed like the tide was turning toward justice, again, another twist shattered expectations. In November 2013, only a month after the judge's decision, Michael Skakel was released from prison on a $1.2 million bond. Yes, you read that right. After more than a decade behind bars, he walked out, pending a new trial, with strict release conditions, where a GPS monitor, have no contact with the Moxley family, check in regularly, and most importantly, do not leave Connecticut. But almost immediately, he broke that last condition. He relocated to Westchester County, New York, in direct violation of a court order. And what happened? Nothing. He wasn't punished. It seemed like privilege once again shielded him from the rules everyone else had to follow. Then came December 2016. In a split 4-3 ruling, the Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated Michael's conviction. They found that the original defense, flawed as it may have been, was legally sufficient. Just like that, Michael was expected to return to prison. But the chaos was far from over. In May 2018, the same court reversed its own decision, this time ruling in Michael's favor by the same narrow margin. They concluded that the original trial had indeed been unfair. Now, Michael Skakel was officially a free man. This reversal, however, did little to clarify what had really happened to Martha Moxley. If anything, it made things murkier. The legal system had become a revolving door, guilty, innocent, guilty again, and then not guilty, all without any new answers. And as the years ticked by, one heartbreaking truth became clear. No one really knew who killed Martha Moxley, but some people still had theories. And they were chilling. With Michael Skakel now free and no definitive answer to who had taken Martha Moxley's life, public speculation only intensified. For many, it wasn't about what the court had ruled. It was about what they believed deep down. And some people were absolutely certain Michael Skakel was guilty. They believed he had been obsessed with Martha, that jealousy and rejection had sent him into a violent rage. They pointed to his changing alibis, his confessions at Elon, and the fact that the murder weapon came from his own home. But there were others who believed the truth lay elsewhere. With Tommy Skakel. Remember, Tommy had been the last confirmed person to see Martha alive. He had lied to detectives early on, claiming he hadn't been with her that night. Later, when the pressure mounted, he changed his story, saying they'd only kissed. He never offered a clear explanation for why he had lied in the first place. And there was something even more disturbing. Martha's tutor, Ken Littleton, had initially offered an alibi for Tommy. But after doing so, his life fell into complete disarray. He lost his job, became reclusive, and eventually spiraled into personal and legal troubles of his own. Some speculated that Ken had been coerced or pressured into protecting Tommy. And when the guilt became too much to bear, it destroyed him from the inside out. Still, there's a third theory, one that chills to the bone. What if both brothers were involved? It's a terrifying thought, but not an impossible one. Both Michael and Tommy lied to police. Both changed their stories. Both had potential motives, opportunity, and a clear connection to the murder weapon. And let's not forget Michael's own statements at Elon, the ones in which he allegedly said, "I drove her skull in, and I made a mistake." Were they just dramatic outbursts from a troubled teen under pressure, or admissions of guilt? Some believe the brothers may have conspired, or that one committed the murder while the other helped cover it up. They believe the Skakel family's wealth and influence bought silence, manipulated timelines, and muddied the water just enough to keep the truth buried. Even today, decades later, these possibilities hang in the air like fog, impossible to ignore, but impossible to prove. And at the center of all this darkness was one undeniable fact. A young girl had been brutally murdered, and no one had been held responsible. All these years later, almost everyone connected to Martha's case has faded from the spotlight, either through death, silence, or scandal. All except one, John Moxley, Martha's older brother. Now in his 60s, John is the only surviving member of the Moxley family. He has spent 5 decades grieving, advocating, and hoping for answers that have never come. He still wonders what really happened to his sister that October night. He still asks the same haunting question the rest of the world has been unable to answer. Why? Why was Martha taken from them? Why didn't anyone protect her? Why has no one paid for what happened? Despite everything, the trials, the theories, the headlines, John still doesn't know who killed his sister. And that, perhaps, is the most painful part of all. A 15-year-old girl was beaten to death and left in her own yard, steps away from the safety of her home. And 50 years later, her family is still begging for justice. It has now been over 50 years since the brutal murder of Martha Moxley shocked the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Belle Haven. 50 years of speculation. 50 years of trials and retrials. 50 years of whispers and headlines, privilege and power, guilt and denials. And still no one knows the truth. We've watched as suspects were arrested, confessions were dissected, and powerful names were dragged into the spotlight. We've seen alibis shift like sand, friendships crumble under pressure, and one family, Martha's, left completely shattered. Some insist Michael Skakel is guilty. Others point to Tommy. Many believe both are responsible. Some believe that neither one did it. But here's what we know for sure. Martha Moxley was failed. She was failed by investigators who overlooked Tommy early on. She was failed by a legal system entangled in politics and celebrity. She was failed by those who had the power to protect her and didn't. And now, decades later, we're left with circumstantial evidence, conflicting statements, and far too many unanswered questions. The justice system may have closed its book, but the rest of us can't. Because when justice takes a backseat to power, when truth is drowned in noise, and when a young girl's voice is silenced without consequence, we all lose. Thank you for watching. Every victim deserves their story told. If you found this story shocking and heartbreaking, subscribe to Crime Uncovered and help keep their memory alive. What do you think about Martha's murder? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep questioning everything.